You won't, but I'll keep my fingers crossed you make an A. All right, thank you all for coming today. Chapter 6 is an interesting chapter, I think, but in a way it's sort of a light chapter and not quite as much detailed and really unusual information as some of the chapters that we have encountered. There's not the range of vocabulary and the new concepts that some of our chapters have. So my plan is to move through chapter 6 through the content that is in your book fairly quickly, and then spend a little more time than usual on your guided practice and some of the kinds of application activities that we really want you to carry away from this course so that you will become familiar with the idea of actually taking these things that we talk about in here and applying them to real life learning situations with students when you begin teaching in the schools. Now, one of the questions that students often ask me, particularly when they move into the later stages of our program, is why do we have to write these detailed lesson plans? You know, they require us to submit a whole page or 2 pages of lesson plans, and we have all these things, and our teachers don't really do that. So one of the things that I want you to start thinking about now, since we require you to do lesson plans in here as well, is I want you to start thinking about reasons why we might ask you to do lesson plans that may be more detailed and more elaborate than the teachers you're seeing. Have any of you seen the lesson plans or the teachers' lessons plans in your collaborative? Or maybe you're familiar with the teacher's lesson plans if you're a substitute teacher or something. Usually a whole day's worth of lessons is written on 1 page rather than just one lesson written on a whole page. But we require you to write considerably more extensive lesson plans than that when you're at the beginning level of your teaching. And one of the reasons I think that's important is because they really serve as a roadmap for you when you're not quite as familiar with where you're going as you will become. So I look at it like this. If you're going to California, you'd probably want to get a map, wouldn't you? Because you might have some general idea that you need to head west, but gosh, the particulars about how to get there might be a little vague, right? And you might even end up in California if you didn't have a map. It would improve your probability if you started on the Katy Freeway. But certainly if most of us were going to California, we would get a road map before we set out on that trip and determine the exact route that we were going to take in order to get there. We'd be real clear on where we wanted to go. For one thing, would make a great deal of difference if we wanted to go to San Francisco or San Diego, right? So the first thing we'd do is get real clear on where we're going in California, and then we would probably get a map and plan out the best route for us to take in order to arrive there in the least amount of time possible. Now, I wouldn't suggest maybe that you get a road map if you're going home on the freeway this afternoon, would I? Hopefully, and there may be more turns involved actually in your route home this afternoon than, you know, if you were going to California, you really don't have to turn much till you get to San Diego. You just sort of go out I-10 and it turns into I-8, and then pretty soon, before you know it, you've driven 1,500 miles and you're there. You may turn 8 or 10 times on your way home from school this afternoon, yet you don't need a map, do you? Because you know the way. You've done it over and over and over, and you're real clear on your objective, and you're real clear on all the component parts that are necessary to execute in order for you to get there, right? So it's sort of this way about lesson plans and lesson planning. And one of the reasons that we require you to do more extensive lesson plans is we want to make sure as emerging teachers you know exactly where you want to go and have planned out the most expedient way in order to get there. And really our chapter 6, or our lesson for today, is devoted to this concept of planning and executing effective instruction for all students. And we're going to be examining the different components or aspects of planning and executing teaching that result in effective instruction for all of your students. We know that if a certain variety of variables that have been isolated through research are evident, that the presence of these variables does in fact exert a positive influence on student behavior. And two of the most important aspects are, first of all, planning for content coverage, and then using effective instructional procedures to arrive at the acquisition of those objectives. We know that if you are going to cover content in a lesson, it should be based on specific objectives that are included in that lesson. One of the things that we observe, particularly in new teachers who are planning lessons for the first time, is they think of things that are very creative and very wonderful and exciting activities that the children really enjoy, and they're lots and lots of fun and they're very hands-on, but guess what? They don't teach anything the child needs to know. They're very entertaining and they're very involved and they're very hands-on and they're very wonderful, but they don't result in the attainment of any of the educational objectives that are intended for children at that age and that grade level. So one of the things that you need to keep in mind is no matter how wonderful your lessons are, how creative and entertaining and hands-on they are, if they don't result in the acquisition of specific instructional objectives that are intended for students at that grade level, then they're not appropriate. Do you see? Yes, Brianna?
Like if you wanted to make something really creative, you would just want to make it follow the TEKS for that grade level?
Right. The way we know what students are supposed to learn at a particular grade level is by referring to the TEKS. So you might have a wonderful lesson about the Three Little Pigs. You know, you might have a wonderful activity for kids to do about the Three Little Pigs. But if it isn't somehow tied into a TEK for kindergarten children or for maybe first graders, usually the Three Little Pigs is pretty low, but if it isn't tied into one of their TEKs, it doesn't serve any useful purpose as part of your curriculum. So, do you have to throw out the Three Little Pigs? Not necessarily. You may have a wonderful lesson or something you've seen another teacher do or something that you observed when you were a volunteer at your church or religious center in working with children, or Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts. But you can look through a TEK for kindergarten children, for example, might be barnyard animals. So you might be able to tie the story of the Three Little Pigs into barnyard animals and have the children start by identifying what is a pig and how is that pig different from other barnyard animals, and so on and so forth. And then end in that kind of activity and maybe have the children write a story about three little horses and three little cows and three little whatevers. You see, you can tie it in that way. You might be able to tie it into counting. You might be able to tie it into color identification. There are many, many ways you can take wonderful activities and convert them into activities that result in the attainment of objectives. But it is very important for you to base the objectives of your lesson on things that are contained in the TEKS, because these are the things that you will be held accountable for at the end of the year as a teacher, to say my children know how to count through 5 and they know how to identify colors and letters and sounds of the alphabet and so on and so forth. So you need to take this approach. Now, Chapter 6 also goes into objectives. I know that we have worked some on objectives in our guided practice because they were necessary in order for you to write the lessons. But Chapter 6 gives you a good review of what constitutes an instructional objective. And according to your book, I think actually when we talked about guided practice, we had 4 parts. Did we, Kim, or not? In any event, Some textbooks require instructional objectives to have 3 parts, some have 4. We can live with either one in here, but your book identifies saying an objective is having to stipulate what is going to be taught, the conditions under which the student's performance will be assessed, and the criteria for acceptable performance. The other element in instructional objectives is sometimes the who the students, or all students, or 90% of the students, or whatever. So sometimes that's another component, particularly in behavioral objectives. But you need to get clear and rehearse. We noticed that some of you had a little bit of trouble in assignments that required objectives in your stipulating exactly who the person is, what they need to know, under what conditions the skill will be exhibited, and the level of proficiency. So keep in mind these 4 objectives, and know that this sort of content of instruction that we're talking about is based on a sequence of objectives that are contained for us in the TEKS. You should have looked those up on the internet by now. If you haven't, or if you have difficulty finding them, they're not hard to find, and you can email either ask a generic question on the bulletin board for the WebCT, or ask one of the assistants and they can show you where to find the TEKS. But in any event, these objectives from for your lessons are based on the TEKS and are specified for all learners by grade level in the state of Texas. In addition, you will see sometimes specific objectives that are not included in the TEKS as being relevant for a child's IEP if that child has been evaluated and deemed in need of special education or related services. You will have other instructional objectives that may or may not be part of the grade level TEKS. They may be even based on the TEKS, but not as extensive, and not have the breadth or depth or scope that the TEKS would have. Our TEKS really specify the breadth and depth of the curriculum that a student is to encounter, and the way they are, the scope of them and the sequence with which students move through those objectives are specified as well by grade level. So the good news is that you are told as a beginning teacher exactly what to teach. You know, the bad news, on the other hand, your creativity in teaching that is somewhat governed. The curriculum is somewhat governed by the specificity with which that is delineated. So you can't just go out and teach as part of the curriculum ballet because that is something that's of interest to you, or something that's important to you, and it's something you like. So you need to keep those things in mind when you're talking about and thinking about the kinds of things that you're going to do for general ed learners as well as students with disabilities. The curriculum not only includes the instructional materials used for learning, but also the course of study for each discipline. So you will find that there are math TEKS and reading and language arts TEKS. And there is a scope and sequence of those for each grade level. They do not, however, determine the specific instructional objectives. They specify content, but you can specify the instructional objectives. You can determine if the objectives are going to base the identification of farm animals on the story The Three Little Pigs, or if something else is going to be used for that. Does that make sense? Particularly when you get into the upper elementary grade levels, we have things like students will demonstrate mapping skills and how to move from one location to the next. And it doesn't make any difference if the lesson requires the student to go from Houston to San Diego or Houston to Miami. the idea is that the student uses a map in order to achieve some predetermined destination. An early childhood TEK may be the student can identify same and different. So your same and different might be blocks, and your same and different might be stick figures, and your same and different might be something else. So to that extent, your instructional objectives allow you to express your individual interest in your freedom and your creativity while still achieving the essential element, which is the students will demonstrate the ability to distinguish same and different. So these kinds of things are important as you move into lesson planning. Another thing that's very important for beginning teachers is developing appropriate pacing, determining the time at which and rate at which you move through a curriculum. Pacing has several different aspects, and it's really quite an art to pace your lesson in an appropriate way. If you move too fast, you leave some of them behind. And if you move too slow, some of them get bored and move on in their minds to other things and are not really with you. So it's quite an art. We talk about with itness a lot, and our ability to look out at the group of students that we're teaching and monitor whether or not they're with you, and if they're not, bring you back on track. But one of the things we can do that increases the probability that they'll stay with us is to move on at a challenge level pace, but not so fast that we leave some students behind. And there's an art there that allows us to do that. Another aspect of pacing that's usually problematic for beginning teachers is judging how long it is going to take you to do a lesson. Sometimes I observe teachers in Quest 2, and they will have a wonderful, wonderful lesson, and the teacher's given them 20 minutes to teach it. And guess what? The lesson's an hour and a half long. You know, they get through the very first part of it, and oops, their 20 minutes is over. Another thing that happens is sometimes a student has a wonderful, wonderful lesson, and they have 20 minutes to teach it, and in 5 minutes they're finished. So these are sort of art forms that you will acquire as you become more polished and more refined and more able to go about the business of deciding how much time a particular activity or lesson will fulfill. But pacing is very important because it's one of the ways we keep kids with us and draw them in and monitor whether or not they're understanding and keeping up and with us. Another aspect of lesson planning is to determine what types and levels of learning are going to occur. And there are a variety of types of learning that your book talks about. And different disciplines are more inclined to emphasize one aspect of learning or another, but certainly a very basic level of learning is discrimination learning. The sheer ability to look at one stimulus cue and determine how it is the same or different than another stimulus cue. We'll get to concepts in a minute. But one of the ways that students learn to formulate concepts is by acquiring the similar characteristics or the crucial, for example, a dog. It's hard to tell what makes a Great Dane a dog and what makes a Chihuahua a dog all at the same time, right? But eventually we learn the similar characteristics. We learn to discriminate dogs, for example, from wolves. But children don't learn that very early. They don't learn that until they get a concept for what constitutes being a dog. The initial stages of of learning are almost always discrimination learning, determining what goes into a category and what stays out. How many of you have taken Dr. Lieberman's class already, the 3300? What does Piaget call this type discrimination learning? Dr. Lieberman is going to be very angry. Look up here. You cowards, don't you remember what Piaget? Huh? What is assimilation? Huh? You don't remember about assimilation and accommodation? Well, assimilation.
Accommodation is where you use the table mic. Now I don't remember what assimilation is.
Oh, okay. Well, they haven't said anything. You haven't missed a word. In any event, for those of you who are not going to talk, use the table mic for the nothing that you're going to say when I ask you a question. In any event, when Piaget talks about assimilation and accommodation, basically what he says is that when children, maybe children have learned that a Chihuahua is a dog, and so they see a Pekingese and they say, well, he's small and he has furry and he barks and he has 4 legs and paws and this sort of thing, so he must be a dog too. So he assimilates dog into what he knows based on sort of this discrimination learning and concept formation. Because gosh, looks, you know, it's the looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it must be a duck type thing. So pretty soon he goes along and he encounters a horse. He says, oops, this is not a dog. So he doesn't know where a horse fits in with things. So he accommodates this new information by developing a new schema in which he puts horse that allows him to distinguish horses and other kinds of bovine and equine in a different category than he might put dogs. Does that make sense to you? This is the sort of discrimination learning that takes place very early in a child's life and is very necessary for school in order to learn things like the alphabet, the letters of the alphabet and the numbers, and the concept that an L is not a 7, you see. That's discrimination learning and concept formation that says the L is a letter and it looks like this, and while very similar, the 7 is a number and it looks like that. Now, factual learning is another type of very lower order type learning, and we depend a lot on factual learning in school, probably too much. Certainly, according to many people's opinions, we depend too much on factual learning. But names and dates and of the sequence of historical events and famous people and what their accomplishments were, inventors and what they invented, states and their capitals. All these things are factual learning. The names and order of the planets, all these things are factual learning, and we just expect students to learn those things. Another type learning is rule learning. We have to learn such things as A before E except after C, and on the end of a letter, an E is a silent letter. On the end of a word, an E is a silent letter, and so on and so forth. In addition, we learn procedures. We learned procedures for solving mathematical equations. We learn procedures for executing science experiments and this sort of thing. We learn procedures for driving a car, and we learn procedures for riding a bicycle. Sequences of events that result in a predetermined outcome once the procedure is fully executed. I talked a little bit about concept formation and how we form concepts through discrimination learning. But another type of higher order learning is problem solving, applying analytical and deductive reasoning skills, inductive and deductive reasoning skills to new situations, so that we're going from a whole to determine the parts of a relationship and maybe how something works, or taking the parts and organizing them into a new and unique whole. This type of problem solving that's based on analytic reasoning and inductive and higher order thinking is important. In addition to the different types of learning, there are different levels of learning that students exhibit in school. The very primary kind of level is acquisition level. This is when a student can actually execute an operation or respond to a stimulus cue in an accurate manner. For example, you may present a child with the word cat, C-A-T, and the child sounds that out, k-at, and he ultimately unlocks the word cat. He is at the acquisition stage of learning. He can do it, and he can do it correctly, but it may be so slow it isn't very useful. And so once we have the initial acquisition of learning, we strive for fluency, or the fact that he can work a sufficient number of problems in sequence in a reasonable amount of time. Sometimes we negotiate for students with disabilities what constitutes an acceptable level of fluency. We may have students who are required to work 20 multiplication problems, but we may have a child whose IEP calls for him or her to only work 5 or 10 multiplication problems. So sometimes we negotiate fluency requirements based on a child's IEP. Application and generalization are a serious problem for many children with disabilities. I think we have mentioned in here before that if we don't use what we learn in school after we leave school, it's purposeless learning. Do you remember me saying that to you earlier? And that's not just for children with disabilities, it's for everybody. If you don't have any further use for the information that you learn in school, then you might as well not be using it, right? And maybe we have too much purposeless learning in school. I don't know. That's for somebody else to debate, not but me. But I haven't quoted too much Shakespeare here in my adult life, so I don't know if I really needed to read that or not, but my senior English teacher thought I did, so I read it. Certainly, with children with disabilities, it's very, very important that we teach them things that they will need to know later in life. This type of learning is called normalized or functional learning. We want to teach people with disabilities normalized skills that make it easier for them to fit in with the general population. And we also want to teach them skills that are useful, that will be useful. Years ago, when I used to work with mentally retarded youngsters, we would want to work with them on fine motor coordination, for example. So we would teach them to string beads to improve their fine motor coordination. But no adult that I know really needs to know how to string beads. How about you? I don't do too much bead stringing myself. So somewhere along the way we realized that bead stringing was not normalized behavior for young adults, and that if we wanted to teach fine motor skills to these youngsters, we would be much better off to teach them to button their shirts, or to sort silverware, or do some skill that might be exhibited in a normalized environment, for one thing, and also that would be useful to them at a later time in their lives. So we really stress application and generalization of skills learned in school. First, we stress it on the selection of curriculum for students with disabilities. We try to target the skills that they will need later in life and build a curriculum for them that is based on those very skills and abilities, so that we're teaching them down here to do what they will need to know out here. But there's another problem with that. We realized after many, many years in special education that many children with disabilities are not as likely to generalize the skills that they have learned in school into normalized settings. So we have to actually teach generalization. I may have mentioned this to you earlier. I can't remember whether I did or not. But there have been several studies done on even high-functioning special ed kids after they graduated from high school. And their parents would be summoned and say, you know, how did you like your school? Yeah, I like my school. How'd your child like it? Oh, he loved it. How about your teachers? They were great. How about school? It was wonderful. What is your child doing now? Well, he just sits at home and watches television. So obviously the school wasn't too wonderful, because it didn't result in these kids using the skills that they have learned to foster an independent lifestyle for themselves, where they become employed and are independent and so on and so forth. So one of the things we really work on these days is application, a curriculum that's applicable to later in life, and then training that will result in generalizing these skills to normalized environments that will result in a person with disabilities having greater independence and freedom and job opportunities and so on and so forth. When we ask for students to apply and generalize what we teach them, we focus on two different aspects of skill acquisition. One is the identification. I try to require you to do both identification and production in 3360, because we know that multiple assessments give a more accurate picture of a student's overall achievement than just one type or another. So here come next Tuesday, you're going to have to perform identification, because you will have to read a question and identify from 4 possible foils what the best answer to that question is. That is, in your terminology, in the terminology of this class, an example of my asking you to identify acquired information. The other type is production or generative type expression of learning, and of course that comes along more within your guided and independent practice. In this particular site, we set up a scenario and say, from the world of possibilities, based on what you have learned, what would you do with this student under these circumstances, or how would you apply this information in this particular case? Does that make sense to you? And we have that same approach to students in school. We want to know, first of all, that they can identify the correct information, and second, that they can apply it in unique and different settings and in new ways, unique ways and in unique settings. Those are the two types of things. Now, we've talked quite a bit about learning and about different types and levels of learning and planning for instruction and why we do that and so on and so forth. But another aspect of teaching is also, once you decide what you're going to do and can evaluate the level at which you expect people to do it, how do you transmit that into actual teaching that achieves the end result that you want to get? And it's an interesting thing. You know, we've been studying teacher effectiveness for 30 years, you know, and looking at all kinds of variables that are supposed to result in a teaching effectiveness. What kind of personality do teachers have? I did my whole dissertation on personality characteristics of teachers of the emotionally disturbed, and you know what I found out? I don't remember. I don't remember because it wasn't very significant. I might have made it. I think I did manage to write it up in some way that I got it published. I don't know exactly how, but I can tell you it wasn't anything earth-shattering that's going to change the world for anybody. Personality characteristics don't seem to mean much when it comes to teaching. And we've talked about management styles. I'm sure you've all heard about the authoritarian manager and the permissive manager and the authoritative manager is the best and blah, 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 blah. But, you know, really and truly, what does it all mean? I'm not sure. We looked for these, you know, flowery, you know, sort of hyperbolic ways to distinguish effective teachers from ineffective teachers year after year after year after year, and we really didn't find anything of substance. But guess what? When we looked at some variables that are much more closely related to what teachers actually do rather than how they think or how they feel or how they are or what their personality characteristics are, we found out that regardless of what their personality characteristics or their management styles were, that effective teachers exhibited a set of behaviors that made them markedly different than less effective teachers. And those things are important things for you to learn and know because they can make a real difference in the extent to which you impact the students in your classroom and affect learning in that population. And an abundant amount of research has been done in this area and has supported the idea that, first of all, academic engaged time is very, very important. When we talk about academic engaged time, we talk about the amount of time during the school day that students are actually involved in purposeful learning. Teachers all have about the same amount of time every day. You know, you're going to have about 7 hours with your kids every day. It becomes a matter then for you to decide how you utilize that 7 hours, right? There will be some guidelines for that provided to you by your district. You will probably be required to spend about an hour and a half on language arts and reading and about 30 minutes on math and about 30 minutes on this and that and the other. There will be some guidelines for how you divide and spend your time on a daily basis. But you will all teachers in the state of Texas will have about 7 hours with their students. So it becomes very important how you use that 7 hours. And one of the things that we know is that classrooms in which students engage more of their time in productive academic learning, these classrooms have students with higher academic achievement. In other words, if you spend more time learning what you're supposed to learn, you do actually learn more of it. Makes pretty good sense, doesn't it? I don't know why we didn't think of that 30 years ago when we were studying personality characteristics, but for some reason we didn't. In any event, it's important for you to know and remember that the more time you spend with your students actually engaged in academic learning, you're more likely to have students who exhibit increased academic achievement because these two things go hand in hand. So the question then becomes, how do I get my students engaged in academic instruction most of the time? And one of the ways is that we eliminate student off-task behavior. All the time the students are off task, they're not engaged academically. Your whole group may be off task, or just a few students may be off task. But for everyone who is off task during instructional time, then learning is not taking place. So it becomes your job as a teacher to make sure the most children possible are engaged the most amount of time possible in tasks that result in purposeful learning. One of the things that we can do to increase purposeful learning is increase teacher on task behavior. We hear about student being on task all the time, don't we, criticize? Oh, he's out of his seat, he does this, he does that, he stares off in space, he gets up and moves around, he sharpens his pencil. But you don't hear teachers complaining about how much time they waste, do they? Do you? Well, a guy named Coonan, I have to tell you about Coonan. He's an interesting fella. We'll talk about him more later, too, I think. You may have to remind me about this, but he actually started out teaching emotionally disturbed children. And he went on to the University of Michigan, I believe, but don't quote me on that. He went on to the University of Michigan and became fascinated with including students who were emotionally disturbed in regular general ed classrooms. And prior to Coonan coming along, we really had this two-box theory of education that we have talked about earlier that said, you know, there's one set of methods and materials that are good and important and useful for special ed kids, and another set of instructional materials and teaching methods that are appropriate for general ed kids. He said, well, I wonder what would happen, what I would learn about teacher effectiveness if I put an emotionally disturbed child in general ed classrooms. So he went into a school and took grade 1 and grade 3 and grade 5 and infused in those grade levels a child who was emotionally disturbed, just had pretty bad behavior. And said, let's see what happens now. Well, guess what he found? He found that there really wasn't much to the two-box theory of education. He found that teachers who were really good at managing the behavior and organization in their own classrooms were also very good at managing the teaching and behavior of kids that were emotionally disturbed. So good management results in good management regardless of who it's for. And then he began to study little bitty vignettes, study these videos by the frame to see what was happening when kids were doing what they were supposed to do and what was happening when they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And he found out that there is a core of teacher behaviors that really greatly influence whether or not kids are going to be on task or off task. And there's one thing you can say about it. You can write this in ink. When kids are doing what they're supposed to be doing, there's one thing we know for sure. They won't be doing what they're not supposed to be doing. So to the extent, I heard someone talking yesterday, they said, oh my goodness, we're involved in a grant and we're trying to determine whether or not if we bring students, these behavior disordered students' behavior under control, whether or not it will improve their achievement. I said, well, you're going about it backward. If you will improve their achievement, you will by definition improve their social behavior. Why do you think I say so? Because kids who are doing, first of all, if kids are doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're going to be successful. If they're successful, they're not going to be acting out. If they're not going to be acting out, we won't care if they have a behavior disorder or not, you see, because they won't bother anybody, right? There's a lot to be said for that. So, these teacher behaviors that make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to do when they're supposed to be doing it serve a multitude of purposes. They not only result in increased academic achievement in your classroom, but they also eliminate any number of undesirable behaviors, because when kids are doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're not misbehaving. So we know that with regard to this on-task teacher behavior, when you have smooth transitions and get from one subject to the next, and when you don't spend time feeding the fish and looking for your grade book and having to search the drawers of your desk for a pencil, all of these kinds of things, you have an opportunity to focus your students on the learning at hand. And this is an essential element, according to your book, because it promotes on-task and therefore high achievement. But in reality, it also goes a long way toward interrupting or disrupting disruptions because they don't have an opportunity to occur. So the element of on-task teacher and on-task student behavior is very important. Yes, ma'am.
Who is the gentleman who did the study?
Coonan, Jacob Coonan.
Jacob Coonan, how do you spell that?
Kounin. He was an interesting fella. He's done a lot of interesting things, but he's best known for his classroom management stuff. His name will probably come up again when we do our chapter on classroom management. But he has identified things as transition times, with-itness, dangles, you know, where you start something and then before you finish that, you go on to something else. There are about 5 or 6 specific teacher behaviors that he has identified that result in poor classroom management. They are these gaps that invite misbehavior to occur, because there's one thing for sure: you cannot ask children to do nothing. What happens when they have nothing to do? Their behavior of choice is usually not what you want it to be, right? So don't give them too many choices about that. Give kids choices, but not the choice of doing nothing, because when they do nothing, their behavior of choice is not generally what you want it to be. So anyway, Coonan's an interesting fellow. You'll encounter him again in classroom management, but we'll also probably talk about him again. I don't remember for sure, but probably in another couple of weeks. But the notion of increasing engaged time by streamlining transition activities, cutting down on inappropriate verbalizations, cutting down on inappropriate social behaviors are all important aspects of good classroom management that increases engaged time. If a misbehavior does occur, it's very important to handle it quickly and get on with it so you can get back to learning, or just redirect the student without overdwelling. That's another thing Coonan identifies, is the teacher who overdwells on things. You know, the teacher who says, okay, now sit up in your chair. Oops, sit up now, sit up like a student. No, sit up. Now all this time we're trying to get this one kid to sit up and write, you know, assume the right posture writing. Everybody else is all over the place. So these kinds of things are not a good idea. Another thing I wanted to emphasize to you right now, because I think that even very good teachers often suffer from this shortcoming, is the notion that if I have a really great classroom management system, it ought to be good enough for everybody. The truth is, even teachers who have very, very good classroom management, teachers in which students seldom misbehave and very little time is spent on calling them down and disciplining them, this is when I know a teacher has really good classroom management. I had a student teacher one time in the 5th grade, and we were at our seminar doing the student teaching seminar on classroom management. And I said, which one of you has a teacher that has really good classroom management? This girl, she said, oh, my teacher's the best. You know, I teach in 5th grade and my teacher is great. And she said, no one ever misbehaves in there. And I said, well, what does she do? And she said, I don't know. Nobody ever misbehaves. That's when you have really good classroom management, is when it is an unspoken thing, because you see no time is spent on classroom management when you don't even know what the teacher does. It's just so embedded. The rules and the structure are so embedded in the classroom. But even that teacher will eventually have a child in the 5th grade for whom her system or his system does not work very well. And then it becomes incumbent upon you to use strategies for individual cases. Nobody can be a wonderful classroom manager if you're not willing to address individual children who break the rules and devise an individual strategy for coping with their misbehaviors. You will need to have individual plans from time to time, because no management system, no matter how wonderful, will bring every child in your classroom under stimulus control at all times. It just won't happen. So you have to be willing as a teacher to say, I have a great management system. It works for all the kids most of the time, or most of the kids all of the time, but it's not working for Jane. I really think Jane needs to be moved up closer to my desk, worked with a time clock, have on-task behavior rewarded with checks every 5 minutes. You have to be willing to do some individual case studying for some of the children some of the time, or those children are going to continue to drive you crazy, and you're going to continue to say, well, I can't imagine what's the matter with Jane. All of the rest of my children are on task and do exactly what they're supposed to, so there's something wrong with her. But she's still going to be in your classroom all year, so you better be willing to stretch a little bit and attempt to meet her needs and bring her in too, because she has all day to drive you crazy. And you have 30, 25 or whatever other kids to teach. So make sure that you remember and make room for the individual cases. Now, your book talks about the SCREAM variables. You know, our book really loves the acronyms. And so I do think some of these are a little, the SCREAM variables, if you will, might be a little bit better and more informative than some of the acronyms that we talk about. But structure is certainly an important component of effective teaching, and really structure refers to the organizational components of your classroom and the structuring lessons so that the teacher is able to communicate to students about the overall organization and purpose of the lesson. We know without question, based on sound empirical evidence, that if students know what is expected of them, they are much more likely to learn it. So one of the most important things about your lesson is the structure that says, today we're going to focus on this. What I want you to learn is that. Once children know what they're supposed to learn, they're much more likely to learn it. A clear outline of how the lesson is going to proceed, and making smooth transition points is important. Emphasizing critical points over and over. We'll talk a little bit more about review before we end today. Summarizing and reviewing throughout is important so that you will know, kids know what went on before you proceed in the lesson. The clarity of speaking directly to the object, the learning objective, and letting the students know the appropriate sequence and terminology. One of the things that is very important about clarity in a multicultural society like you will probably be teaching in is to make certain that the students know the vocabulary. I can't emphasize enough the importance of vocabulary development. Some of our language skills are very complex as we move into social studies concepts and science concepts. And these are not words that children are likely to acquire vicariously in English, even if they're in a setting where English is spoken most of the time. They may not know what a test tube is, or they may not know what a Bunsen burner is. So it's very important that we explain to them what a Petri dish is if they're going to need to use a Petri dish for this science experiment. So this sort of clarity in making sure you're stating the important points and stating them succinctly and teaching vocabulary that is needed to master the lesson's objectives is very important, as are re-emphasis and going over points a sufficient number of times. You know that we emphasize guided practice and independent practice to make certain that students have this sort of relearning and redundancy that they need. And of course, enthusiasm's an important point in our lessons too. Enthusiasm tends to be contagious. Some of you may have heard about some of the teachers that are on Oprah and get the National Teaching Award and these kinds of things. They do things that are just seem so unlikely. But I worked in a school one time where the teacher, she was a third grade teacher, and she happened to be from Panama, you know, where they have rainforest, and she emphasized the ecology a great deal and taking care of the environment and so on and so forth in her class. But every year in her third grade class, the rainforest grew up. And every year, every week when you'd go in there, there'd be a new layer of the rainforest. And finally, by about this time of the year, there'd be vines hanging down in the room, and the whole room had turned into a rainforest. And she had integrated all of her TEKs for math and science and social studies and reading and language arts. Maybe not all of them, but many, many, many of them, into this evolution that resulted in the rainforest. Well, these children will probably never remember learning third grade phonics skills or third grade math skills, but they will never forget having a teacher where the rainforest grew up in their room, and they all had little terrariums that replicated this. I mean, it went on and on and on and on and on, but it was wonderful. She was a wonderful, wonderful teacher because of her enthusiasm for this rainforest. I don't know if you all will remember, but I saw this on television some time ago. There was a male teacher in Florida, in Miami, in the ghetto with very low SES kids there. And this man was burned up with playing chess for some reason. That was his passion, was playing chess. And of all the unlikely things in the entire world, he had taught these very low SES children to play chess. And there was a chess club at the school, and these kids was very popular in his school to be on the chess team. Now, can you imagine really getting 7th grade boys to play chess? I can't imagine, but he loved chess, and of course it's a very high, it promotes very high levels of abstract thinking. Chess is so difficult. Anyway, these kids, of course, got great at being chess players, and they had earned a berth in some national chess competition, and they were out washing cars, which is how they happened to be on TV. They were out washing cars on Saturday or Sunday, trying to get enough money together to go to this chess tournament, wherever it was, and demonstrate their skills and compete for national titles. And I mean, who'd have thunk it, really? You know, how did he get these kids to do this? I don't know. His enthusiasm for this task at hand. But I can tell you, when kids are playing chess after school, they're not smoking dope and kicking tires. This they're not doing. So it's your enthusiasm and your ability to ignite children with the things you're enthusiastic about. It had nothing to do with playing chess. It had to do with him. I went to a high school where being in the band was the best thing in the world. Our band teacher was so great, and he took us all over the place. How he put up with us, I'll never know. We were so bad. I don't know how he did it. God bless him. But he took us everywhere, and even the football boys in my high school played in the band when they weren't playing football. They only took off for those 2 or 3 months in the fall when they were playing football, and then I mean, it doesn't seem likely, does it? But it was true. All the neat kids in my school were in the band, and it was only because I know it, but we were. I was so little, my uniform had to be held on with suspenders, but anyway, I barely made a foot in the door with this band. And we got to go on all these neat trips. We went on a band trip every year to Del Rio, and we went to all kinds of competitions and things. And our band was very good, only because Mr. Carrico made us be good. I didn't have any desire really or any musical ability, but I wanted to be in the band because that's where all the neat kids were, and everybody behaved because he had the authority to kick you out of the band if you weren't relatively socially appropriate. So it's interesting to see. Some of you may have seen the Teacher of the Year. He's on Oprah from time to time from North Carolina that went to New York City to teach in a ghetto school. Nobody's heard this. I don't think people in my class ever have a television. I mean, I don't know how you've missed this guy. How you really don't have a TV. Well, anyway, Oprah, in case y'all know, I mean, have you heard of Oprah? You know, she's a kind of a neat lady here. Most people I thought had heard of her, maybe not, but anyhow, one of the things that she does is promote teachers. She promotes teachers a lot, but one thing she does also is bring a lot of attention to the Teacher of the Year and appoints a Teacher of the Year and so on and so forth. And it's a big competition, and I expect one of my students to get that award one of these days and tell Oprah I taught you everything you know. So, but anyway, this guy was from North Carolina, and he decided that, you know, he was just spinning his wheels in North Carolina and he wasn't getting anywhere. And he had this call to go to New York City and work in a ghetto school, and so he did. I mean, this was a white guy, and he decided to quit his job and go to New York City, so he went to this PS 298 or whatever it is in the middle of Harlem and knocked on the door, and the principal said yes, you know, and he said, I want to work at your school. She said, really? You know, I don't know how this is going to work out. He said, I can do it, I can do it. Anyway, she said, well, hey, whatever turns you on, you know. So the principal gave him a job at this school, and the rest of the saga that he's gone around the country talking about is how he won over these 5th grade children in this ghetto school. And the interviews with these children are amazing, but he had written letters to the parents and gone to meet the parents and do all, and of course he had a very heavy accent from North Carolina. And they were very suspicious of him at first, but gradually, over a sufficient period of time, he began to win them over. And he learned to do rap music and hot peppers on the jump rope and all that stuff. And he converted much of their curriculum to rap songs and rap music, and they would jump the rope and say their math facts. Do you remember this guy? Did you? Well, it was a very fascinating thing. And the reason that I say this to you is not because I want you to teach your kids math facts by jump rope, but what I want to encourage you to do is develop enthusiasm about things in your life and share those with children in a way that channels the appropriate instructional objectives into their achievement levels. And you can certainly do that with many curricular and extracurricular activities. And I think when you get to the point as teachers that you're just going through the motions and just going through the teaks and just going through the tacks, it bores not only you, but it bores the children as well. And so this level of enthusiasm that's so important is often missing for us. Your book talks about rate, which is really more about pacing, and also maximizing engagement. We talked a little bit about those earlier. And finally, the notion that as you're teaching, it's very important to move through questioning and feedback strategies and praise strategies. We often don't do that with children. I was in a meeting just last week with a student teacher who was having a great deal of difficulty, and the problem with the student teacher is that she was teaching but nobody was learning. You know, you can't just teach. You have to find out by questioning and by getting feedback from kids and by monitoring their social behavior and their involvement, whether or not they're learning what you're teaching, because it isn't sufficient for you to just teach. Somebody's got to be learning something out there too. And we have a variety of techniques available for really monitoring that and seeing if the students, if the learners are really on our own page. Not only are they looking and listening, but are they assimilating at the appropriate level of the things we have to say. And I do think that is a skill, but you have to acquire the skill. And the student that we were working with and we'd observed, we had structured and talked to this student many times. This was about the third observation for the student. And so we were really needing to impress upon the student the importance of not only teaching. It doesn't matter how wonderful your PowerPoint is if nobody's looking at it, right? So we need to make sure when we are going through the motions of doing this that we have kids who are with us and who are responding and answering questions, so we know that they're with us. So right now I'm going to stop for our break. I'll be back in a minute. Thank you.